So first of all, the kind of impact. There are several kinds of effects that we may observe associated with having IER in our data, including decreased reliability, changed factor structure, and attenuated substantive associations, and sometimes inflated associations. Of course, the impact goes beyond survey data. So first of all, let's talk about the psychometric impact. Reliability may be decreased when we have IER in our data. And here I'm using Larry's scale on organizational citizenship behavior toward organizations, published in Journal of Management back in 1991. So as you can see, there are 4 sample items here. One of the items adheres to informal rules devised to maintain order. Well, for whatever reason, maybe the respondent was not paying too much attention. Maybe there's a TV show going on. Maybe this sentence is just slightly confusing to someone who's not paying full attention. For whatever reason, the respondent picked 1 when they were really 4 or 5 on that particular item. So their standing should have been 4 or 5, but they picked 1. This introduces noise in the measurement. So when we have increased the error in the measurement process, then reliability would decrease. The second kind of psychometric impact is in the factor structure that we observe, whether we are conducting exploratory factor analysis or confirmatory factor analysis. When IER occurs to scales with negatively worded items. So that means those items are worded in the opposite direction than what the construct is referring to. In this case, so I'm using slightly different sample items here, but the first 3 items indicate the high end of organizational citizenship behavior, whereas the last 2 items were actually the low end or the negative end of OCBO. Takes undeserved work breaks and complains about insignificant things at work. So again, for this particular respondent, they were thinking they were reasonably high on OCBO, but again, due to lack of attention or effort or both, the person selected 4 and 5 on those 2 items. They were reverse scored. Now, once we correctly score those 2 items, the person will have a low standing on OCBO. And when there's, say, 10% of respondents who don't pay enough attention to the survey items and miss those negatively worded items, then on the right, this is the kind of factor loadings and structure matrix you may observe. In the end, we may end up with 2 related factors, right? The first factor is loaded by the loadings are by the 3 positively worded items, and the second factor is loaded by the 2 negatively worded items. Again, those negatively worded items have been correctly reverse scored. So those 2 factors were positively correlated to each other, and the correlation here is 0.39. But the end result is we observe a negative method factor that's dominated by items that are worded in the opposite direction. Now, aside from the psychometric impact, we also see substantive impact when we observe careless responding or IER in our data. So when a predictor or when a predictor and criterion variable were measured with some increased noise due to IER, then the prediction will be weakened if we could separate those attentive respondents from those who engage in IER, then this is the kind of pattern we will observe. For a predictor, it will reasonably well, the prediction of an outcome will be reasonably well for normal respondents, but the prediction would be attenuated or will become non-existent in those respondents who just didn't pay attention. Now, more recently, the discovery of the impact of IER is more insidious, right? Because more than acting as an attenuating variable, the presence of IER can also act as measurement confound, which inflates the observed associations between two variables. So when this happens, well, researchers may inadvertently observe an effect due to IER, which really inflates the type 1 error rate for their hypothesis. And I'll quickly go through the mechanism why that would be the case. So starting with a presumed scenario, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume all the attentive responses were completely accurate. So assume what we observe here, attentive responses, are just true scores. When we have some other respondents, and by the way, one circle here indicates one respondent. When we have some other respondents who just completely randomly filled out the survey, we have IER data, so that would simply be error variance. If we go ahead and pull those two subsamples together, in essence, what we obtain in the pooled responses on that variable is a combination of true score variance and error variance. In this case, the error variance introduces noise in the measurement process. So under this particular scenario, we have increased noise in measurement, we have reduced the reliability of our substantive scale. Now let's look at an alternative scenario. Again, let's assume these attentive responses provide attentive respondents provided true scores. And again, each circle is a person. In this case, however, the attentive respondents have had a mean that's slightly higher than the midpoint of the response scale. Again, we scatter in some IER cases. And because there is a mean difference between attentive responses and IER, we now have a negative association between IER behavior and people's responses in general. And if we go ahead and combine these two sources, now we not only have increased error variance in the measurement process, we also observed a negative covariance between attentive and IER scores. And this negative covariance, if present in two substantive scales, it will inflate the observed association between those two variables. Now let's look at a simple simulation of data that's based on 7-point Likert scale. And for the 200 attentive cases, there's mean on those two substantive measures were slightly higher than the midpoint of the scale on both measure X and Y. So that's on the left panel. On the panel on the right, we scattered in 20 insufficient effort responses. And because of the presence of those 20 cases, all of a sudden, the observed association between those two variables were now positive 0.19. So that's how IER can introduce methodological confound in substantive measures. Now, there are different mechanisms leading to IER scores to oftentimes end up average around the midpoint of the scale, right? And we're not going into the details of these mechanisms. For example, when we have scores that are attentive scores that are at the high point of the response scale, there's a higher probability for careless or occasional errors to end up pulling the score down toward the midpoint, right? And when there are reverse coded items, then errors will cancel each other out and leading the mean toward the midpoint. The caveat here, however, is if all the items are worded in the same direction, like let's say they're all worded in the positive direction, when people engage in straight lining, there may be a tendency for them to select agree, strongly agree, more so than disagree or strongly disagree. In such an instance, straight lining may yield scores that are higher than the midpoint of the scale. But under many scenarios, a lot of the measurements when we have reverse coded items, we expect IER scores to average around a midpoint of the scale. In the meantime, attentive respondents oftentimes do not score around the midpoint of the scale. For example, when people respond to core self-evaluations, typically people have, in general, people have positive self-evaluations about themselves. So the responses on core self-evaluations will be above the midpoint of the scale. On job satisfactions scales, typically people are by and large somewhat satisfied with their job. And when people are responding to negative affectivity items, well, typically people's attentive respondents mean will be below the midpoint of the scale, such as the case for counterproductive work behavior. So when we have attentive respondents scoring away from the midpoint of the scale, and IER scores that are somewhat average as a group near the midpoint of the scale, we see an impact like this. So between life satisfaction and job satisfaction, if we didn't pay close attention to the presence of IER, the observed association between those two variables would be 0.34. But if we control for the presence of IER, the partial correlation between those two variables, controlling for IER was only 0.25. So there is an inflation of 0.09 between those two variables. And as you can see, between negative affectivity and job satisfaction, the correlation was negative 0.35 before taking into account of IER. And after taking into account of IER, the correlation was negative 0.19. So that's how IER can oftentimes inflate the association between different variables. One more word about the impact of IER. You may think about IER as an issue inherent in survey data, but its impact goes beyond survey data. If we think about objective tests and tasks, people need effort to get it right. So IER would be negatively correlated with performance on objective tests and tasks, such as learning tasks or cognitive ability tests. And again, we're talking about low stakes context, right? So when people respond to survey without paying too much attention, and then they completed these tests or tests, IER can introduce a confound between tests and surveys, even though they were using different, the scores were obtained using different methods. Here in a study on learning and transfer, we can see the correlation between, say, general cognitive ability and motivation to transfer training. We observed a raw or first order, zero order correlation between those two variables at 0.16, but the first order partial correlation controlling for IER was only 0.06, So there was a 0.10 inflation associated with the presence of IER. And so is the case between verbal ability and general cognitive ability. Right? So in general, there is some inflation associated with IER, even across different measurement approaches. And the confounding effect is associated with two factors. One is how consistent people engaged in IER. As you can see, as we move from left to right, the inflation effect becomes worse and worse. Right? When people are really engaging in egregious form of IER, it introduces quite a bit of inflation effect to the observation we had, to the observed association between two variables. And the different curves refers to different proportion of IER in the data. As you can imagine, the more IER there is in the data, the more proportion of the sample, the higher proportion of the sample engaged in IER, the greater inflation effect we observe. Now, taken together, we know inclusion of IER in survey data can be problematic for these reasons. Next, we'll talk about the different approaches we can use to detect IER.